Marcus Washington had always carried himself with the quiet dignity his grandmother taught him, shoulders back, eyes forward, never giving anyone reason to question his right to occupy any space. At 14, he was already an honors student at Riverside Preparatory Academy, one of Connecticut's most exclusive private schools, where tuition cost more than most families earned in a year. His classmates arrived in chauffeur-driven Mercedes and discussed summer homes in the Hamptons like other teenagers talked about weekend plans. Marcus rode the city bus 45 minutes each way, his scholarship covering books and tuition but not the invisible currency of belonging. He'd learned to navigate the marble hallways with the same careful precision his mother used in her surgical procedures. Methodical, purposeful, unshakable. But Victoria Pemberton, daughter of a hotel empire, saw something different when she looked at him. She saw an anomaly that needed correcting, a scholarship case who'd forgotten his place in their carefully ordered world of inherited privilege. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The confrontation had been building for months, like storm clouds gathering on a summer afternoon. Victoria's cutting remarks in literature class, her theatrical sighs when Marcus answered questions correctly, her whispered comments about charity students loud enough for everyone to hear. Each incident was a small cruelty designed to remind him that academic excellence couldn't buy acceptance in their world. The other students watched these exchanges with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a slow-motion collision, too intimidated by the Pemberton name to intervene, too decent to openly participate. Teachers looked the other way, unwilling to challenge a family whose donations funded new library wings and computer labs. Marcus absorbed each insult like a boxer taking body blows, his composure never cracking, his dignity intact even as the psychological warfare intensified. He'd learned from his cardiologist mother that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression was steady, unshakable professionalism, a lesson that would prove prophetic when their worlds collided that fateful Saturday at the Grand Meridian Resort. What none of them knew, not Victoria with her designer handbags and entitled smirk, not her father Robert with his corner office and company car, not the staff who scrambled to fulfill their every whim, was that Dr. Eleanor Washington didn't just practice medicine. She was the silent owner of the entire luxury resort chain, a self-made millionaire who'd built her empire one strategic acquisition at a time while raising her son to understand that true power came not from inherited wealth, but from character forged in adversity. The stage was set for a reckoning that would strip away pretense and reveal the difference between authentic authority and borrowed privilege, between earned respect and demanded deference. In less than 24 hours, assumptions would crumble. Consequences would arrive with surgical precision, and a 14-year-old boy's quiet strength would prove more powerful than all the inherited arrogance money could buy. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Preparatory Academy's literature classroom, casting long shadows across the mahogany desks where America's future leaders sat in their pressed uniforms and polished shoes. Mrs. Henderson, a silver-haired veteran of 35 years in education, had just assigned Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird for their unit on social justice in American literature, a choice that would prove more prophetic than she could have imagined. The irony was not lost on Marcus Washington, who sat in the front row with his worn paperback copy, the same edition his grandmother had read during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. At 14, Marcus possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that reminded older observers of young leaders like Julian Bond or John Lewis, composed, articulate, and unshakable in his convictions. The classroom itself embodied everything that made Riverside Preparatory legendary among New England's elite institutions. Hand-carved wooden panels lined the walls, displaying portraits of distinguished alumni who had gone on to become senators, Supreme Court justices, and Fortune 500 CEOs. The Persian rug beneath their feet cost more than most families spent on a car, and the leather-bound first editions in the glass cases represented literary treasures that belonged in museums. This was where America's aristocracy sent their children to learn not just academics, but the unspoken codes of power and privilege that would carry them through lives of influence and authority. For Marcus, whose mother had fought for every scholarship dollar and every opportunity, the grandeur served as both inspiration and reminder of how far he had traveled from his modest neighborhood across town. When Mrs. Henderson posed her question about the symbolism of the mockingbird in Lee's novel, asking the class to consider what it meant to destroy something innocent and defenseless, the room fell into the kind of thoughtful silence that distinguished advanced placement students from their peers. Marcus raised his hand with the same deliberate confidence he had learned from watching his mother command operating rooms, his voice clear and measured as he spoke about how the mockingbird represented not just Tom Robinson, but anyone who faced persecution for simply existing in spaces where others believed they didn't belong. His analysis was sophisticated, drawing connections between the novel's Depression-era setting and contemporary issues of justice and prejudice, the kind of response that would have earned praise in any academic setting. But Victoria Pemberton, seated 3 rows back with her designer handbag and perfectly manicured nails, had been waiting for this moment like a predator watching prey. At 16, she possessed the kind of cruel intelligence that came from growing up in a world where her family name opened doors and her father's position at the Grand Meridian Resort chain provided her with a sense of untouchable authority. Her blonde hair was styled in the effortless waves that cost $300 to achieve, and her uniform was tailored to fit like a designer dress rather than standard school attire. She had been watching Marcus all semester, cataloging his scholarships, his second-hand textbooks, his careful way of speaking that suggested someone who had learned to navigate predominantly white spaces with surgical precision. "That's a very interesting perspective," Victoria said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that Southern ladies had perfected during the antebellum period, especially coming from someone who probably relates to the character on such a personal level. The pause before personal hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and every student in the room understood exactly what she meant. The implication was clear. Marcus wasn't offering literary analysis. He was speaking from the experience of being an outsider, someone who didn't naturally belong in their rarefied academic environment. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed enough classroom dynamics over 3 decades to recognize the subtle cruelty unfolding before her, cleared her throat uncomfortably, but said nothing. The Pemberton family's donations had funded the new computer lab and the renovation of the gymnasium, and challenging Victoria meant potentially jeopardizing relationships that extended far beyond the classroom walls. This was the delicate dance that teachers at elite institutions learned to perform, balancing educational integrity with the political realities of wealthy benefactors, whose children sometimes wielded their family influence like weapons. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being reduced to a symbol rather than recognized as an individual, the same sensation his grandfather had described experiencing during his years as one of the first black executives at a major corporation in the 1970s. But instead of responding with anger or defensiveness, he simply nodded and said, "I think that's exactly why literature matters, Victoria. It helps us understand experiences different from our own, whether we're reading about Depression-era Alabama or contemporary America. The best analysis comes from being able to see multiple perspectives, not just our own." His response was masterful in its restraint, acknowledging her attack while refusing to be diminished by it. Victoria's eyes narrowed with the frustrated rage of someone whose cruelty had been deflected rather than absorbed. She had expected Marcus to either retreat in embarrassment or respond with anger that would justify her characterization of him as unsuitable for their academic environment. Instead, his composed response had made her look petty and small in front of their classmates, several of whom were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they recognized the ugliness of what had just transpired. "Well," Victoria continued, her voice rising slightly as she abandoned subtlety for direct confrontation, "I just think it's important that we maintain certain standards in our discussions. This isn't a public school where anyone can say anything they want. We're here because our families have invested in excellence, and that means expecting a certain level of sophistication in our academic discourse." The word sophistication was delivered like a slap, suggesting that Marcus's thoughtful analysis somehow lacked the refinement expected in their elite environment. The classroom had become a battlefield where privilege and merit faced off in the kind of confrontation that defined American social dynamics across generations. Other students sat frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or remain silent, their discomfort palpable as they witnessed the collision between inherited entitlement and earned achievement. Some, particularly those whose own families had climbed social ladders through hard work rather than inheritance, recognized the injustice of Victoria's attack, but lacked the courage to challenge someone whose family wielded such influence within their school community. Marcus maintained his composure with the kind of dignity that his grandmother had taught him during long conversations about navigating a world that would constantly test his right to occupy spaces of power and privilege. "I appreciate your concern for academic standards, Victoria," he replied, his voice steady and professional, "and I think you'll find that my analysis meets any reasonable measure of sophistication. Perhaps we could focus on the text itself, rather than making assumptions about who has the right to interpret it." His words carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned that the most powerful response to prejudice was often unshakable competence combined with moral clarity. The confrontation reached its crescendo when Victoria, frustrated by her inability to provoke the reaction she desired, made her final, most damaging statement. "I'm just saying that some people need to remember that scholarship students are guests here, not permanent residents. There's a difference between being invited to the table and actually belonging at it." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, their meaning unmistakable to everyone present. She had crossed the line from subtle microaggression to overt exclusion, making explicit what had been implied throughout their exchange. Mrs. Henderson finally found her voice, though it came too late to prevent the damage that had been done. "Victoria, that's quite enough. We're here to discuss literature, not to question anyone's right to participate in our academic community." But the intervention felt hollow, lacking the moral authority that should have accompanied such a moment. The teacher's failure to address the deeper issues at play, the racism, the classism, the abuse of privilege, would haunt the classroom dynamic for the remainder of the semester. As the bell rang and students gathered their belongings, Marcus remained seated for a moment longer, not because he was shaken, but because he understood that what had just transpired was larger than a classroom disagreement. It was a microcosm of the challenges he would face throughout his life, a preview of the battles he would fight in boardrooms and courtrooms and academic institutions across America. Victoria's attack had been personal, but it represented systemic issues that extended far beyond their elite preparatory school walls. The seeds of the weekend's confrontation at the Grand Meridian Resort had been planted in that literature classroom, where privilege had revealed its ugliest face, and where a 14-year-old boy had demonstrated the kind of grace under pressure that would serve him well in the trials to come. Neither Marcus nor Victoria could have predicted that their next encounter would take place on her family's own territory, where the balance of power would shift dramatically, and where the consequences of prejudice would finally arrive with the force of justice long delayed. The Saturday morning sun cast golden rays through the soaring glass atrium of the Grand Meridian Resort, where crystal chandeliers caught the light like captured stars, and marble floors gleamed with the kind of perfection that only unlimited wealth could maintain. At precisely 10:30 a.m., Marcus Washington stepped through the revolving brass doors, his navy polo shirt pressed and his khaki slacks creased with the military precision his grandmother had taught him during countless Saturday mornings when she'd prepared him for a world that would scrutinize his every detail. The resort's lobby stretched before him like a cathedral of luxury. 30-foot ceilings adorned with hand-painted murals depicting scenes of American prosperity, Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and furniture that belonged in museums rather than hotel lobbies. Marcus approached the mahogany reception desk with the same measured confidence he'd displayed in literature class, his reservation confirmation folded neatly in his shirt pocket, alongside the letter his mother had written explaining his early arrival. The morning clerk, a professional woman in her 30s named Sarah, smiled warmly as he approached, her fingers already moving across the keyboard to locate his reservation. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the trained hospitality that distinguished five-star establishments from ordinary hotels. "How may I assist you today?" Marcus replied with the polite formality his mother had drilled into him since childhood. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Marcus Washington, checking in for the presidential suite. My mother, Dr. Eleanor Washington, made the reservation and indicated I might arrive early. But from across the expansive lobby, seated at a wrought-iron table beneath a cream-colored parasol on the breakfast terrace, Victoria Pemberton's attention snapped to the reception desk like a predator detecting movement. She had been nursing her third cup of imported coffee while berating the waitstaff about the temperature of her eggs Benedict, her silk scarf knotted with the casual perfection that required an hour of practice to achieve. At 16, Victoria possessed the kind of cruel intelligence that came from growing up in a world where her family name opened doors, and her father's position provided her with a sense of untouchable authority. Her blonde hair was styled in effortless waves that cost $400 to maintain, and her designer sundress was tailored to fit like haute couture rather than resort wear. The sight of Marcus Washington, the same scholarship student she'd humiliated in literature class, standing at her family's reception desk with the audacity to request a suite, sent shockwaves of indignation through her privileged worldview. She rose from her chair with such force that her coffee cup rattled against its saucer, her heels clicking against the Italian marble with the staccato rhythm of approaching thunder. Victoria had been waiting for this moment without knowing it, the opportunity to demonstrate the full extent of her family's power, and to remind Marcus Washington exactly where he belonged in their carefully ordered social hierarchy. "Excuse me," Victoria called out, her voice carrying across the lobby with the theatrical projection of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Every head in the vicinity turned toward her. The elderly couple reading newspapers by the fountain, the business executives checking their phones near the concierge desk, the bellhops arranging luggage with military precision. What exactly is going on here? Her tone was sharp enough to cut crystal, designed to shame and humiliate with surgical precision. The morning clerk looked up nervously, recognizing the manager's daughter but uncertain about the source of her obvious agitation. Marcus turned slowly, his stomach sinking as he recognized the voice before he even saw her face. He had hoped that the weekend would provide respite from the constant microaggressions and overt hostility he faced at Riverside Preparatory. But Victoria's presence transformed the luxury resort into another battlefield where his right to exist would be questioned and challenged. "Hello, Victoria," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the familiar weight of being reduced to a symbol rather than recognized as an individual. Victoria marched forward with the confidence of someone who had never faced meaningful consequences for her cruelty, her designer handbag swinging like a weapon as she closed the distance between them. "Is someone going to explain to me why this person is standing at our reception desk like he belongs here?" she demanded, her voice loud enough to ensure that everyone within a 50-foot radius could hear every word. The emphasis on "this person" was delivered with the kind of dehumanizing precision that reduced Marcus to a problem to be solved rather than a guest to be served. Sarah, the morning clerk, found herself caught between professional duty and social pressure, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard as she glanced between the reservation screen and the manager's daughter. "He has a confirmed reservation," she began carefully, "under the name Washington for the presidential—" But Victoria cut her off with the ruthless efficiency of someone accustomed to silencing opposition before it could gain momentum. "If you process that check-in," Victoria hissed, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, "I guarantee you that my father will have your uniform, your badge, and your final paycheck shredded before lunch. Do you understand me?" The threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had watched her father terminate employees for lesser infractions, who understood that in their world, the Pemberton name carried more weight than company policy or basic human decency. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a spotlight he had never requested, his composure tested by the public nature of Victoria's assault on his dignity. "My mother booked the suite," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the growing number of onlookers. "I'm simply here to check in as she instructed." His response was masterful in its restraint, acknowledging the situation without allowing himself to be drawn into the kind of public confrontation that Victoria clearly desired. Victoria's laugh was brittle and cruel, the sound echoing off the marble walls like breaking glass. "Your mother," she repeated, her voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Oh, please. What does she do? Run errands for someone important? Clean houses for the kind of people who actually belong in places like this?" The insults were calculated to inflict maximum damage, designed to reduce both Marcus and his mother to stereotypes that would justify their exclusion from spaces of privilege and power. The lobby had become a theater where American social dynamics played out in real time, where inherited privilege confronted earned dignity, and where the assumptions that underpinned their society were laid bare for all to witness. Other guests shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, uncertain whether to intervene or look away, their discomfort palpable as they recognized the ugliness of what was transpiring before them. Some, particularly those whose own families had climbed social ladders through hard work rather than inheritance, understood the injustice of Victoria's attack, but lacked the courage to challenge someone whose family wielded such influence within their elite social circles. "This is the Grand Meridian Resort," Victoria continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "Not a community center, not a scholarship program, not some kind of outreach initiative. Unless your last name is carved into the foundation stones of this building, you have no business requesting our premium accommodations." Her words carried the weight of generations of exclusion, the kind of gatekeeping that had kept American institutions segregated long after legal barriers had supposedly fallen. Sarah, the morning clerk, found herself paralyzed between the truth displayed on her computer screen, a legitimate reservation with VIP status and executive-level authorization, and the social pressure being applied by the general manager's daughter. The presidential suite had indeed been booked by Dr. Eleanor Washington with specific instructions for early check-in and concierge services, but challenging Victoria Pemberton meant risking her employment at one of the most prestigious resorts on the East Coast. It was at this moment of maximum tension, when the confrontation had reached its crescendo, and the lobby had fallen into the kind of uncomfortable silence that precedes either resolution or explosion, that the brass revolving doors began to turn with deliberate, measured precision. The sound of approaching footsteps, confident, purposeful, unmistakably authoritative, caused every head in the lobby to turn toward the entrance. Dr. Eleanor Washington entered the space like a force of nature contained within a tailored gray power suit, her leather briefcase in one hand and her hospital identification badge visible on her lapel. Her face was composed with the kind of professional calm that came from years of making life and death decisions in operating rooms. But her eyes burned with the cold fire of a mother who had just witnessed her child being publicly humiliated. The transformation in the lobby's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Victoria's triumphant smirk began to falter as she registered the newcomer's obvious authority, while Sarah's relief was visible as she recognized that the situation was about to shift dramatically. Marcus felt his shoulders relax slightly, not because he needed rescue, but because he knew that justice was about to arrive with the precision of a surgical instrument wielded by someone who had never lost a battle that mattered. Dr. Eleanor Washington surveyed the scene before her with the clinical assessment of a trauma surgeon evaluating a patient, taking in her son's composed dignity, Victoria's defensive posture, the nervous energy of the hotel staff, and the uncomfortable attention of the gathered guests. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, the kind of power that didn't need to be announced because it was simply assumed. "Take your hands off my son," she said, though Robert Pemberton had not yet appeared on the scene. The words were delivered as both warning and promise, a statement that established the new balance of power in the room and served notice that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. The lobby held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the carefully controlled environment of the Grand Meridian Resort. A moment when privilege would finally meet its match in the form of quiet, unshakable authority backed by both moral clarity and legal power. The brass revolving doors of the Grand Meridian Resort turned with deliberate precision, and through them stepped Dr. Eleanor Washington with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 25 years making life-and-death decisions in cardiac operating rooms across America. At 48, she carried herself with the composed dignity that came from breaking barriers in a profession where women of color were still rare, where every surgery was performed under scrutiny that her white male colleagues never faced. Her charcoal gray Armani power suit was tailored to perfection. Her leather briefcase bore the subtle patina of success earned through countless 18-hour days, and her hospital identification badge, clearly visible on her lapel, announced her credentials to anyone with eyes to see. The transformation in the lobby's atmosphere was immediate and electric, like the moment when storm clouds finally release their burden after hours of threatening thunder. Every conversation ceased mid-sentence. Every movement froze in place, and even the soft classical music seemed to fade into insignificance as Dr. Washington's heels clicked against the Italian marble with the measured rhythm of approaching justice. She surveyed the scene before her with the clinical assessment of a trauma surgeon evaluating a critical patient, taking in her son's composed dignity despite being physically restrained, Victoria's defensive posture as she realized her world was about to shift, the nervous energy radiating from hotel staff who sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented, and the uncomfortable attention of wealthy guests who had never seen privilege challenged so directly. Robert Pemberton still had his hand gripping Marcus's arm when Dr. Washington's voice cut through the silence like a surgical scalpel through flesh. "Take your hands off my son." The words were delivered with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to command attention, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question in situations where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Robert's grip loosened involuntarily, his face draining of color as he registered not just the woman's obvious authority, but the implications of what she had just said. "Mrs. Washington," Robert stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to process how dramatically the situation had shifted in the span of 30 seconds. "I didn't realize, we weren't informed." But Dr. Washington raised one perfectly manicured hand, and his words died in his throat like a candle flame snuffed by a sudden wind. The gesture was small, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of absolute command that came from years of directing surgical teams through complex procedures where hesitation could prove fatal. "You didn't realize what, exactly?" Dr. Washington asked, her voice maintaining its professional calm, while her eyes burned with the controlled fury of a mother who had just witnessed her child being publicly humiliated. That a 14-year-old boy checking into a hotel room his mother reserved might actually belong there? That perhaps you should verify facts before putting your hands on a minor? Or that your assumptions about who deserves respect in this establishment might be fundamentally flawed? Each question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to expose the rotting foundation of prejudice that had led to this moment. Victoria, who had been frozen in place since Dr. Washington's entrance, finally found her voice, though it emerged as a trembling whisper rather than her usual commanding tone. "This is impossible," she said, her words barely audible above the lobby's stunned silence. "He's just a scholarship student. His family can't possibly own anything like this. There has to be some mistake." The desperation in her voice was palpable, the sound of someone watching their entire worldview crumble in real time. Dr. Washington turned her attention to Victoria with the same clinical focus she brought to examining X-rays that revealed unexpected pathology. "Young lady," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect in rooms full of men who initially questioned her qualifications. "Your assumptions about my family's circumstances are as misguided as your father's decision to assault my son. But more importantly, they reveal something deeply troubling about how you've been raised to view the world and the people in it." Sarah, the morning clerk, stood behind the reception desk with her fingers hovering over the keyboard, caught between the truth displayed on her computer screen and the social pressure that had been applied by the Pemberton family. Dr. Washington approached the desk with measured steps, her briefcase clicking softly against her leg as she moved. "Sarah," she said, reading the young woman's name tag with the same attention to detail that made her an exceptional surgeon, "would you please confirm the reservation details for the presidential suite?" Sarah's relief was visible as she turned to face someone who clearly outranked everyone else in the lobby, regardless of family names or inherited positions. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice gaining strength as she read from the screen. "The presidential suite is reserved under Dr. Eleanor Washington, with VIP executive status and specific instructions for early check-in privileges for Marcus Washington. The reservation includes concierge services, private dining options, and access to all resort amenities." Her words fell like hammer blows on the coffin of the Pembertons' assumptions. Dr. Washington nodded once, then reached into her briefcase and withdrew a black leather credential holder that she opened with practiced efficiency. The gold badge inside caught the lobby's crystal chandelier light as she held it up for everyone to see. "Eleanor Washington, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Legacy Hotels," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the marble-floored space. "This resort, Mr. Pemberton, is one of 17 properties in our portfolio. You have just physically removed the owner's son from a property that my company has operated for the past 8 years." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of Robert Pemberton's swallowing was audible to guests sitting 30 feet away. His face had progressed from pale to ashen, and his hands were visibly trembling as the full magnitude of his error became clear. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air, her designer handbag slipping from her shoulder to hang awkwardly at her elbow. Furthermore, Dr. Washington continued, her voice maintaining its professional tone while delivering what everyone present recognized as a death sentence for Robert's career. You made these assumptions and took these actions in front of witnesses, staff members, security cameras, and dozens of guests who will undoubtedly remember this incident for years to come. You have exposed this resort to potential lawsuits, damaged our reputation, and violated every principle of hospitality that distinguishes a five-star establishment from a roadside motel. Marcus, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation with the same composed dignity he'd displayed in literature class, finally spoke. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "I'm okay, really. I knew you'd handle this." His words demonstrated the kind of mature understanding that came from growing up as the son of a woman who had fought battles against prejudice and assumption throughout her professional life. Dr. Washington's expression softened for just a moment as she looked at her son, but when she turned back to Robert Pemberton, her face was once again the mask of professional authority that had served her well in countless difficult situations. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, effective immediately, "you are terminated from your position as general manager of this resort. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, and you will be removed from the premises within the hour. A formal letter of dismissal will be delivered to your residence by tomorrow morning, along with legal documentation regarding the assault on my son." Robert's legs seemed to buckle slightly, and he reached out to steady himself against a marble pillar that had probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I have a family. I've worked in hospitality for 23 years. This was just a misunderstanding. If I had known who he was—" But Dr. Washington cut him off with the same decisive authority she used when terminating unsuccessful surgical procedures. "The problem, Mr. Pemberton, is precisely that you needed to know who he was before treating him with basic human dignity," she said, her words carrying the weight of generations of struggle against the kind of prejudice that had just been exposed. "A professional in your position should treat every guest, regardless of age, race, or apparent economic status, with the same respect and courtesy. The fact that you failed to do so reveals a fundamental character flaw that makes you unsuitable for any position in the hospitality industry." Victoria, watching her father's career disintegrate before her eyes, made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that drew uncomfortable glances from nearby guests. "We didn't know. How were we supposed to know? He looks like—" But her words died as Dr. Washington's gaze fixed on her with laser-like intensity. "He looks like what, exactly?" Dr. Washington asked, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried more menace than shouting ever could. "Like a young man who doesn't deserve respect, like someone who couldn't possibly belong in a luxury resort, like a person whose dignity is negotiable based on your assumptions about his background." Each question was delivered with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, building an irrefutable case against the prejudice that had led to this moment. The assistant general manager, who had been hovering at the edge of the confrontation with the nervous energy of someone trying to decide whether to intervene, finally stepped forward. Dr. Washington acknowledged him with a slight nod, then delivered her final instructions with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions that would be implemented without question. "Please ensure that Mr. Pemberton's access to all hotel systems is immediately revoked. Security should escort him from the premises with courtesy. More courtesy than he showed my son, but with absolute firmness. I want a full incident report on my desk by 5 o'clock this afternoon, including statements from all staff members who witnessed these events. As security officers approached to escort Robert Pemberton from the resort he had managed for over a decade, Dr. Washington turned to her son with an expression that mixed maternal pride with professional satisfaction. "Shall we check in?" she asked, her voice returning to the warm tone reserved for family conversations. Marcus nodded, his composure never having wavered throughout the entire confrontation, and together they walked toward the elevator bank while the entire lobby watched in respectful silence. The brass elevator doors closed behind them with a soft whisper, leaving behind a lobby full of witnesses who had just seen privilege meet its match in the form of quiet, unshakable authority, backed by both moral clarity and legal power. The Pemberton era at the Grand Meridian Resort had ended not with celebration or ceremony, but with the simple, devastating truth that respect should never be conditional on assumptions about who deserves it. In the months that followed that transformative Saturday at the Grand Meridian Resort, the ripple effects of justice continued to reshape lives in ways both profound and permanent. Robert Pemberton's termination became more than a personnel decision. It became a watershed moment that sent shockwaves through the hospitality industry across New England. Within 72 hours, his 23-year career lay in ruins, his industry connections severed, and his family's privileged lifestyle crumbling like a house of cards built on borrowed authority. The luxury condominium overlooking the harbor, the country club memberships, the private school tuition, all vanished when the corporate benefits that had sustained their elevated status disappeared overnight. Victoria's fall from grace proved equally dramatic and instructive. Stripped of her father's position and the social armor it provided, she found herself navigating the harsh realities of public education, department store clothing, and the kind of scrutiny she had once inflicted on others. The girl who had weaponized privilege now understood its fragility, learning firsthand how quickly assumptions could reshape one's world when the tables turned. Marcus, meanwhile, emerged from the ordeal not with vindictive satisfaction, but with the quiet dignity that had sustained him throughout the confrontation. His response to victory revealed character that impressed even seasoned observers. He showed no interest in his tormentor's downfall, expressing instead a hope that they might learn to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. Dr. Eleanor Washington's swift implementation of company-wide bias training and dignity protocols demonstrated that true leadership creates systemic change rather than simply punishing individual failures. The story's resolution reminded everyone present that in America, respect should never be conditional on assumptions about who deserves it, and that grace and victory often teaches more powerful lessons than revenge ever could. Have you ever witnessed a moment when quiet dignity triumphed over loud privilege, or experienced the power of standing firm in your principles when others questioned your right to belong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonates with your own experiences. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us why character always wins over circumstance in the end.